In both of our ascending and descending tracks, those neural pathways involved sending information to the brain or receiving information from the brain. So in both the ascending and descending tracks, we were either sending information to the brain or receiving information from the brain. So those neural pathways involved higher brain centers in order to make decisions. There are some neural pathways that actually do not require input from higher brain centers, and those are called reflexes. So neural pathways that do not require input from higher brain centers are known as reflexes. Reflexes are rapid, predictable motor responses to a stimulus. They are unlearned, they are unpremeditated, and they are involuntary. So reflexes are a rapid, predictable response to a stimulus. They are unlearned, they are unpremeditated, and they are involuntary. So again, in a reflex, this is a neural pathway that does not necessarily require input from higher brain centers. Reflexes could be somatic reflexes if they activate skeletal muscle, or they can be visceral reflexes if they activate our visceral organs or our visceral structures, so our smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands. Visceral reflexes are also known as autonomic reflexes. So reflexes are somatic if they're activating skeletal muscle. They're visceral if they're activating smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands. Reflexes are going to contain 5 components. So a reflex arc contains 5 components. First, a reflex arc is going to contain a receptor. The receptor is going to sense a change in some variable. So some stimulus is going to produce a change in a variable. That change in a variable is going to be sensed by a receptor. That receptor is going to generate that sensory information. It's going to pass that sensory information to an afferent or sensory neuron. So we've got a stimulus causing a change in some variable. It's going to be sensed by a receptor. That receptor is then going to give that sensory information to an afferent or sensory neuron. The afferent or sensory neuron is then going to bring that sensory information to an integration center. In a reflex, that integration center is going to be the spinal cord. So the integration center is going to be the spinal cord. So the sensory neuron is going to synapse at the spinal cord. It's then going to send information directly to a motor neuron or an efferent neuron. It's going to carry that motor output to an effector. So in a reflex arc, we've got a receptor, a sensory neuron, integration center, motor neuron, and effector. So the receptor is going to sense a change in some variable. That sensory information is going to be sent via a sensory neuron to the integration center. At the integration center, the sensory neuron is going to communicate with a motor neuron, and that motor neuron is going to carry motor output to an effector. So we're going to take a look at an example of a somatic reflex. Again, a somatic reflex is going to activate skeletal muscle. So the effector is going to be skeletal muscle. The example that we're going to walk through is the patellar reflex or the knee-jerk reflex. So when you go to the doctor at your yearly physical, oftentimes the physician will take this device and they'll tap your knee. When they're tapping your knee, they're tapping the patellar ligament and they're testing your reflexes, specifically your somatic reflexes. So the stretch reflex or the patellar reflex is an example of a somatic reflex. So we're going to walk through the stretch reflex using the 5 components of the reflex arc. So when you tap on the patellar ligament is ultimately going to pull on this muscle here, the quadriceps. So it's going to cause the quadriceps to stretch. So the quadriceps muscle is going to contain this specialized receptor called a muscle spindle. So a muscle spindle is this specialized muscle cell that acts as a receptor to sense stretch. So we've got a receptor called a muscle spindle. It's a specialized muscle cell that senses stretch. When you tap the patellar ligament, the quadriceps muscle stretches. That stretch is going to be sensed by the muscle spindle, and that sensory information is going to be passed to a sensory or an afferent neuron. It's going to bring that sensory input through the spinal nerve, the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, and to the integration center, which is the spinal cord. So the first component of our reflex arc is a receptor. In this case, the receptor is a specialized muscle cell called a muscle spindle. That muscle spindle is going to sense stretch when the patellar ligament is tapped. That stimulus or that sensory information is going to be sent to a sensory neuron. That sensory neuron is going to bring that sensory information through the spinal nerve, the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, to the integration center, which is the spinal cord. At the spinal cord, that sensory neuron is going to synapse on 3 different cells. So first, that sensory neuron is going to synapse directly with a motor neuron in the ventral horns of gray matter. So first, that sensory neuron is going to synapse with a motor neuron, specifically a somatic motor neuron, in the ventral horns of gray matter. That somatic motor neuron is going to innervate the quadriceps. It's going to stimulate the quadriceps to contract. So in response to stretching of the quadriceps are going to contract. So first, that sensory neuron is going to synapse on a somatic motor neuron in the ventral horns of gray matter. It's going to tell that somatic motor neuron to contract, or somatic motor neuron to send motor output to the quadriceps in order to stimulate the quadriceps to contract. Second, that sensory neuron is going to synapse on an interneuron that's going to then communicate with another somatic motor neuron in the ventral horns of gray matter. However, this somatic motor neuron is actually going to innervate the antagonist muscle of the quadriceps, which is the hamstrings. So muscles typically come in pairs. There's an agonist and an antagonist. The agonist is going to cause some movement. The antagonist tends to inhibit that movement. So in order for the agonist to cause a movement, it needs to be activated to contract or stimulated to contract, and the antagonist has to relax. And so if we want the quadriceps to contract, if the quadriceps are the agonist, that means that the hamstrings, which are the antagonist, need to relax. And so the sensory neuron is going to synapse with an interneuron that's going to inhibit the somatic motor neuron that innervates the antagonist muscle. This is called reciprocal innervation. So this is where we're inhibiting the contraction of that antagonist muscle. So we don't want that antagonist muscle to contract, because then when the quadriceps contract, it's not going to cause the movement we want. So the second synapse is going to be that sensory neuron synapses with an interneuron, that synapses with a somatic motor neuron in the ventral horns of gray matter. It's going to inhibit that somatic motor neuron in order to prevent the antagonist muscle from contracting. That's known as reciprocal innervation. Lastly, that sensory neuron is going to synapse with an interneuron of an ascending tract. So that sensory neuron is also going to synapse with an interneuron of an ascending tract, which is bringing that sensory information to the brain. So even though a reflex does not require input from higher brain centers, we still want to let the brain know what's happening. So that sensory neuron is going to synapse with a third cell in the integration center, and that's going to be an interneuron. It's going to bring that sensory information to the brain. So the fourth component of our reflex arc is then going to be the motor neurons. So motor neurons are going to carry motor output to effector organs. So in this example, there's going to be two motor neurons, one of which is going to be activated. It's going to carry that motor output to the quadriceps or the stretched muscle, stimulating it to contract. The other motor neuron is going to be innervating the antagonist muscle, the hamstrings, and it's going to be inhibited, so it's going to prevent the hamstrings from contracting. So the fourth component of our reflex arc was the motor neuron. And then the fifth component of the reflex arc is going to be the effector, which is going to be skeletal muscle. Specifically, the stretched muscle is going to be stimulated to contract, whereas the antagonist muscle is actually going to be inhibited from contracting, so it's going to relax.